Hey, Trinity Church, Ronnie Mack coming at you with Friday's devotional, as you can see, in a rainstorm. Hey, rarely does the devotional line up so well with the passage that was preached on Sunday. I want to encourage you to listen to Pastor Randy Singer's message from this past Sunday. Even if you have already listened to it once, I would highly recommend you listen a second time. It is that good and that powerful. He preached on Acts 28 and the impact of the shipwreck and the detour that God allowed in Paul's life on the island of Malta. We see in the scripture today for today's devotional in Acts 27, Paul is en route to Rome when the ship he is on, along with 276 others, encounters a horrible series of storms, and the ship is completely torn apart. But there was no loss of life. Have you ever wondered about why, when we are doing the will of God, why do we experience times of suffering, struggles, or great hardships? The question in the devotional today is, what impresses you about how Paul handled himself on the ship? Paul knew that he was acting within the will of God, and looking back at Acts 23, we see this passage. The Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." And God affirms this in today's passage. So the Lord had already affirmed to Paul that he would be traveling to and testifying in Rome. This is what impressed me about Paul. Knowing that he was acting in the will of God, and because he was an experienced sailor, Paul knew the best season to sail and when not to sail. We know from the scriptures that Paul had been shipwrecked 3 times. He spent night and day in the open sea. Paul advised the captain that this was not the best time to sail. See, Paul knew storms were likely, and not just any storms, but potentially devastating storms, life-threatening storms. But Paul did not question God's will for his life. And when the storms hit, Paul could have said, "I told you that this was not the weather to sail in." He could have rubbed it in. Human nature is to say, "I told you this is what would happen." But Paul did not do that. Paul spoke the words of encouragement that God gave to him. Paul stood and gave witness of what God had spoken to him. See, we all face storms. Some are physical, some are hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, maybe even a rainstorm like I'm experiencing now. Or it can be personal, a loss of job, a loved one, raising children, or even facing a pandemic. Storms are a part of life. The question is not if storms will come or when they will come. The question is, how will you respond to the storm when it comes? Because it's coming. Paul found himself in a storm. Even though sometimes in the midst of the storm we feel alone, as if God has abandoned us, but he hasn't. The same God that sustained Paul on that ship will sustain you in the storm that you're in right now. All you have to do is trust and obey. Paul trusted in what God spoke to him. Storms are some of God's best tools, and even though I don't believe God causes every storm, I believe that God uses every storm for our good and his glory to mold us into the image of Christ. We see fear and doubt creeping into the heart of the Apostle Paul in verse 20 of chapter 27. Paul says, "We finally gave up all hope of being saved." Last week, my grandson Mason and his Gigi gave a devotional on faith, and Janet stated that faith and fear cannot coexist. When faith walks through the front door, fear runs out the back door. At least it should. It is only when Paul and the men on the ship finally gave up all their own human efforts. They had done everything they knew to do. Trim the sails, dump the cargo, clear the decks. It was then God said, now I'm going to intervene. Let go and let God, folks. It's that simple. You must decrease and Christ must increase. God sent the angel to Paul, and the angel said in verse 22 through 25, what Paul spoke to the men, but now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I've served stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, man, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Folks, God can't save you from your storm until you are ready to surrender them to him. How many of you are in a storm right now? How many? How many are struggling and don't seem to be making any headway against your circumstances or situations that the storm has brought in your life? It doesn't matter who you are. This world is going to leave some battle scars. But saints, we don't battle as if we have no hope, because as believers, we have hope. Our hope is not in the things of this world. Our hope is in God, who did not spare his only son, but gave him up for us. So if God is for you, who can be against you? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution separate us from the love of God? Are you kidding me? In all things, we are more than conquerors through him who loves us. Life is what happens to us while we're making other plans. Paul was looking ahead to Rome, but God has something for Paul to do before he got to Rome. A man plans in his heart, but God directs his steps. The same God that we read about in our Bible on a daily basis, the same God that fought for the Israelites against the Egyptians, that closed the mouth of the lion when Daniel was in the lion's den, who entered the fiery furnace with the 3 Hebrew boys and allowed them to walk around in the fire, the same God who spoke to Paul and said, not one on this ship will be lost. This God is not a God who is distant. He is closer to you than your own heartbeat. The same God, folks. The same God that spoke creation into existence. The same God is the God that is waiting for you to surrender. And all you have to do is trust and obey. Will you trust him today with whatever storm you are facing? Will you trust God today with whatever storm you are facing? And remember, Trinity Church, spread the gospel and not the virus. I'm Ronnie, Mack.